Okay, so I was reminded when I thought about today's talk that the last time I addressed the AESC was in 1994 at your conference in Barbados. So it's been a while. How many were at that conference? No one. Okay, good. So this will all be new, and it's good to be back, I have to say. And when Karen asked me to talk a little bit about executive compensation, I really thought, you know, there's a lot out there about it, and I don't want to rehash the old things that are out there. I mean, we've all heard about how executive pay is rising, how more and more of executive pay is delivered in long-term incentives and equity in particular, which is the most complicated part of the package, and that performance shares are growing in prevalence. So we've all, how many have heard these themes, right? We've all heard about that. And instead, I thought back to some of where we've partnered with search consultants in our work in coming up with reasonable and good compensation packages for either CEOs being promoted into their position or new CEOs coming in, or anyone at the executive level for that matter. And I thought, you know, where are the pain points here? And the biggest pain point seems to be in the whole area of where corporate governance intersects with executive compensation. And I thought I'd talk about that today because I think understanding more about corporate governance, what are some of the pressure points that compensation committees and top-level managements, if they're bringing in the next level right below them, what are some of the pain points that they're experiencing there? And through that, hopefully that we would all have an opportunity to empathize more with our clients and with some of those pressures. And as we all know from our spouses or significant others, empathy is the key to a good relationship. So that is what I thought I would talk about today, a little bit more on governance than on exec comp itself. But I'm happy to also address questions on exec comp. And I don't want to necessarily make you into governance experts in the next half an hour or you know, dull this, this great conference with some mind-numbing detail. But I thought we could talk about, you know, how this understanding of governance could then help build bridges between the clients and their interests and the candidates that you're trying to recruit for them, and really help build relationships all around. So with that, let's see, I want to advance this. No one's given me the tutorial here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Just a little bit about our firm, Fairing Advisors. We were founded in 2007, and really with the idea that we would create a firm for the next generation, not only paying attention to the pay side of the equation, but the performance side as well. And so we deal a lot with particularly large companies, but we also deal with small companies as well, who really want to build best-in-class pay programs and ones that do comport with some standards of good governance. And so that's been our hallmark. Our firm is domestic. We have about 25 people working on the East Coast and the West Coast, but we also are affiliated with the Global Exec Comp and Governance Network, and this is an organization of independent exec comp firms around the world, and it allows us to provide a global service as well. That's me, and then these are just some of the representative clients that we work with, and I would say that we've crafted or helped to craft executive pay packages for all of these types of companies. And you know, we often do this, and it's through this experience that I've thought through kind of where the intersections are with search consultants and where some of the learning can be. So with that, let's go to today's agenda. One of the big things is to understand kind of how the power is shifting in the world of executive compensation in terms of the decision making, the importance of governance to that, and then how you as search professionals can help in that equation. So this is a chart of the S&P 500, the index over the last 20 years. And it's kind of interesting because whenever there's an economic crisis, that of course ushers in a whole new wave of governance, and then that ushers in a whole new wave of needing to understand what the context is within which people are operating, particularly in the realm of executive compensation. So we saw the dot-com crash of the 2001-2002 era, and that of course ushered in Sarbanes-Oxley and brought a whole host of regulations around executive comp. And then, of course, we saw the Great Recession come in 2008 and 2009, and that ushered in the Dodd-Frank Reform Act and many of the implementation rules now that the SEC has to implement, including clawbacks, which is basically if somebody's been deemed to earn their executive compensation under kind of false pretense, needing to restate accounting or things like that, then that compensation can be clawed back. New disclosures around compensation and things of that nature. So this is everything that boards and comp committees are dealing with. And I think they're really feeling the pressure. You know, since Dodd-Frank was ushered in and we had the little recession, and on the left-hand side, you can see here we've got CEO pay across the median across the S&P 500, and it's been rising nicely with a little bit of a hiatus in the Great Recession era, but since then has been rising pretty well. And we see on the right-hand side shareholder value, the S&P 500 index for these companies, and that's been rising as well. And with that, we see that boards and comp committees are really feeling the squeeze between the two. And what's been happening here is there's been a real shift in power from, I'd say, managements that really kind of ruled the roost in the 1990s and even in the early 2000s to today, where independent comp committees acting on behalf of shareholders really have more of the power, and that power has shifted. And what's happened is shareholders are advised by proxy advisors, which are companies like ISS and Glass Lewis, and these companies are telling shareholders how to vote, and they're putting pressure on boards and compensation committees in particular. And even if you're not recruiting an executive at the very, very top level, you're recruiting maybe a level down or two, that person's pay information or whatever may not hit the public radar, but certainly there'll be a bit of a trickle-down effect because those that they report to will hit the public radar. And the way in which shareholders exert pressure are now many, and I've just got a few of the things up here. Director elections, no board member wants to be voted off the island, and so they take the elections pretty seriously, and if they're not going to be reelected, that's an issue. We've also seen proxy access come in, and this is where third parties can put up a slate of board nominees and have that slate voted on if they meet certain criteria and certain conditions. So boards are taking that seriously. Change in control is another one where you have a lot of rules around change in control, what makes sense there, and they can vote on whether they want the change or not and whether they like the pay arrangements around the change in control. So one has to think about that in advance before they get into a change in control situation. Share authorizations, here again, the shareholders are going to vote on whether they're going to allow the executives and the people to get more shares in their pay plans. And so if they don't like the way the pay programs are being used or the way they're being configured, that's another point of pressure. They can vote those down. They can vote additional share authorizations down. And then the last one, which we've all heard a lot about, is say on pay. But my experience is boards tend to take that quite seriously. A lot of them will not like the pressure that they're getting from shareholders or from ISS, but then at the end of the day, they don't want a no recommendation, and certainly they don't want a failed say on pay vote. So all of these things are putting more and more pressure on corporate boards to keep the governance good in the organization and keep the pay packages within reason in the organization and keep those pay packages sensitive to shareholder experience. So why is this important? We actually did a study recently of global governance trends, and it was very interesting. We included 17 countries from around the world in this study, and basically found that, of course, those countries that have the most developed capital markets are the ones that care most about governance. Well, that makes a lot of sense because you have third-party capital coming in, and they're entrusting the board on behalf of their interests to represent them, in essence. And so good governance, the board doing their job in a good governance way, is very important to having a good and robust capital market system. In those countries where the corporations are more family controlled, where governance is not as big of an issue because you don't have this third-party representation as much that needs to happen, governance is a little less of an issue. And we see countries like Mexico really kind of lagging. China is starting to come up in the governance world. And so we have two dimensions here, whether the current approach to governance is weak or intense on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, what's the trajectory? And in most of these countries, we see more and more of the flags going into the upper right-hand corner, where governance is more and more intense, and it's rising in terms of its intensity. And the reason for that is these are the countries that really want to ensure robust capital markets. So there's a reason and a context for everything. And I think we as comp professionals and you as search consultants definitely want to have an appreciation for that, because again, this is a pain point of your client, and having an appreciation is helpful to that relationship. So I thought I'd, without going into exhaustive detail, this is going to be kind of the crash course on some of the governance that one has to watch out for. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to bridge that, because obviously on the other side of it, you have candidates who want the best package and the best deal possible. And a lot of those deal terms can fly in the face of good governance. And so how do you resolve that? And it's not necessarily for you to resolve it, but maybe to team up with a good compensation consultant to help with that, because it does become a team effort. It takes a village after a while. But one of the big things is the pay positioning. What this means is, how are you positioned vis-a-vis the marketplace? And what investors don't like is for you to come up with target pay that's positioned at the high end of the market. Because without any performance, you can still be paid highly, and that's what they don't like. So they're looking for median pay positioning, which means you're in the middle of the pack. Half of the companies are higher, half of the companies are lower. That might be peers of yours, so that you can kind of prove up that you're going to let performance take care of whether pay is high or not. You're not going to just start with high pay. And so there's a pressure point right there. The second is, and this is pretty much all you have to know about say on pay. This is like a crash course in say on pay. If you get these two things right, you probably got it pretty good. As a company. The second thing is pay for performance. So what investors look for is not just reasonable pay levels, but they also look for pay levels that are sensitive to performance. So did actual pay go up when performance went up? Did actual pay come down when performance came down? And did executives feel shareholders' pain when there was pain out there? And so we see things like a lot of accountability. A lot of objectivity needs to be built into the system. A lot of performance-based pay needs to be built into the system. So no more pay for failure here. And pay for failure shows up in many ways. One is just high pay regardless of performance, so that's not performance sensitivity. And another one is where you might have very rich severance packages. So boards and comp committees not only want to understand what are the liabilities that we're taking on the way in, but what are the potential liabilities on the way out? And I would say that in the old days, comp committees really didn't pay enough attention on this. We'd have to encourage them to compute the numbers, Now, if this person leaves, look what you've put into this contract, and look what the liability is going to be if that happens. Oh yeah, this is a great person, that'll never happen, and then 3 years later, we're figuring out what the severance deal looks like, and here it is. So this has been a source of a lot of embarrassment of companies, and shareholders are saying, we're going to cry foul on that. That's pay for failure, and we don't like that. So reasonable severance, no acceleration of equity upon a severance event is a key one. And what we keep seeing here is these pay for failure, let's call them provisions, actually going down in prevalence from where they were before. So we used to see a lot of acceleration of equity in employment agreements. So if an executive was being asked to leave, they might get acceleration of their equity vesting because, gee, it wasn't their fault. Someone didn't like the way they parted their hair or whatever. And investors are saying, and boards on their behalf are saying, no, that's not going to be the case anymore. If somebody put in the service, we might vest for service that they put in, but we're not going to accelerate. And particularly the performance-based elements of the pay, we don't want to accelerate either. So this is another, clash of the titans that we see. We see an awful lot between the candidates and the corporations. And then also investors don't want guarantees. Again, it could be failure down the road, but they're still guaranteed a certain amount. And they don't like contracts, but we realize on the way in, you often have to put a contract in. So we often now see more sunset clauses where that contract goes away after, let's say, 3, 4, or 5 years. And that there's no evergreen contracts. In other words, no automatic renewal of those contracts, where if you have a contract, at least and it's supposed to continue, at least there's somebody looking at it and making an affirmative decision to continue with that, as opposed to it continues by default. So these are all safeguards now to make sure you don't have the pay-for-failure issues that shareholders are concerned about. We also see in the equity plan, again, this is another point where shareholders can put a lot of pressure and say, we're not going to give you more shares. I'm not going to belabor this because this wouldn't directly affect a candidate, but it might affect a candidate down the road, and it might affect sensitivities. But things like ISS is going to support or not support a request for new shares based on the features of the equity plan. Do we have minimum vesting requirements? They look for that. Or, how much discretion does the board have in applying accelerated vesting upon a departure or upon an event, so to speak? How are they using that equity? Are they using it in the right way? There's usually a limit on the number of shares that someone can get so that equity can be deductible. Are there performance restrictions around the equity? What are the grant practices here? And once somebody earns the equity, do they have to continue to hold it? Are there ownership requirements, or do they just get to take the money and run? So these are, again, all pressures we see about thinking about high-profile searches, particularly in public organizations. And then lastly, plan cost. Investors worry about how much equity they, as investors, are transferring to the management, which is what we call plan cost, or have transferred already. And so if we're adding to that by very significant pay packages, that becomes an issue. And one of the most visible ones that we saw was when Tim Cook got promoted at Apple, and Apple has performed really well. Until recently, it's been the highest market cap company in the world. But they still didn't like the fact, even though they put a 10-year term on his stock, they didn't like the fact that much of it was not performance-based, and there was so much of it. It added up to about a $400 million grant, which just seemed too high, a bridge too far. And so actually Apple changed that in a couple years later, where they actually put performance conditions on that equity in retrospect. And then just other practices here that we see, more equity plan considerations. And investors want to make sure that the plan doesn't encourage too much risk-taking. That's a big pressure point. And if there were to be a change in control, they want to make sure that there's not a lot of accelerated vesting. And we've seen these situations where if an executive is about to change control, and the new company that is maybe acquiring this company wants that executive to continue to be in his or her job, CEO, CFO, whatever, then if they get to just walk because their equity all accelerated, then it puts the executive back in the power position and takes the power away from the company acquiring, and could take shareholder value away from the shareholders who are selling. So shareholders are really sensitive to this now. So all the things we might have seen or candidates may ask for in an employment agreement, lots of times companies are less willing to do that, and will continue to be less willing in the future. So we just wanted to make you aware of that, not completely numb your mind. And in thinking about it, and thinking about where we've worked with search professionals to try to get the right deal for high-level executive pay packages, I mean, there's been a few things we've thought about. If you know what the board's sensitivities are, and these days they're sensitive to all of these kinds of things, I think just read the proxy and you'll see what kind of safeguards they've put into place to try to not have to be in conflict with the shareholders, and just being sensitive to it, I think, is step one. It's just an awareness issue of somebody understanding that these are the kinds of pressures that companies are facing today. And even private companies kind of fall into this a little bit, because lots of times private companies will take their cues from public companies in terms of good governance standards. So we see that in a number of situations. And this is not self-serving. There are a lot of us out there. Partnering with a good comp consultant, I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about a couple of pay packages that we've done that are creative, that get the candidate what they need, but then also comport with the standards of good governance. You know, they can be partnering with you and the company and trying to come up with packages that really make sense. So that would be kind of step two. The third is, and we have found this to be really helpful, you know, candidates might say, well, I want X or I want Y. And there's, of course, the upfront package. There's what happens over time. There's what happens on the way out. But if one takes more of a multi-year view, how much wealth does somebody accumulate over time? It can really bridge what they might want right now or what they might want as an annualized package, but what they could earn over time under various performance assumptions. And I'll show you an example in just a minute of where we worked on that very effectively, where the person came in, they wanted what I thought was pretty astronomical, and we figured out how to bridge it with a performance-based package. And then lastly, the shareholder, just understanding, you know, once this package hits the Wall Street Journal or hits the proxy or is just, you know, out there, you know, how is that going to play? Or even plays against, you know, the internal equity relationships that are already in place in a company. What are other executives in that company being paid? And it's just understanding how that will show up in the public disclosures, how the initial equity will play with shareholders as it vests, as it disclosed, and as the person might be on the way out, and actually, you know, making sure that company is calculating the liabilities on the way in and on the way out. So those are the things that we have found most successful in bridging these ideas. So I'm going to show you a couple number slides. Don't freak out because the numbers did get small. I just lifted them from real live situations. But this was an executive and that we had at a $600 million company, which wasn't that big, publicly traded. And the executive said, well, my wife works at Google, and she tells me that I'm worth $10 million a year. And for even the CEO of a company at $600 million, that was a pretty steep package. And we're saying, really? You know, and this wasn't even for the CEO role. It was for a chief technology officer role. And we said, gosh, you know, that one's going to be tough to do. So what we did here is we made some assumptions. The stock price at the time was not doing that well, and that's why they needed this person. And so there was a lot of upside potential. And it also had an overhang of some legal issues and so on. And we said, well, what if that stock price can go from, let's say, where it was trading at the time, $11, $12 a share, to $30. So we made that assumption, which actually wasn't hugely steep, because once they got through these issues, there would be an uplift in the stock price, or to even $40. And what if this executive can really help the stock price triple or quadruple? And then let's take a multi-year view of what that person could be worth. So where it says estimated realizable total direct compensation under the base case, we're actually looking at an upfront grant, which is fairly sizable, which then after the performance happens is worth $18 million on the 2015 grant. And then over time, added to the other elements of pay, adds up to 32 million essentially. And so that's getting us close to our you know, our 10 million a year bogey over 4 or 5 years. That's 30 million, so that's about 7.5 million a year. And then we said, well, what if the price goes to 40? That gets the person almost to $50 million. And so what happened in this particular case by taking a multi-year view is the person was really able to see how they could get from point A to point B, how they could earn that money, and the company could see how that person might be worth it. So this actually turned out to be very effective, and we bridged the gap, and the person said yes and came on board. So that was an interesting one. The second one is similar. This is a situation where we had a CFO candidate that was coming in from the outside, and his current package was $5.3 million for a company of about $3 billion. This was a big, fulsome package for this size company. But what had happened is that this executive had just been with a company, with that $5.3 million, had been with a company that had been sold, and so they were out on the market looking for their next deal, and they certainly didn't want to take less than what they had. And so in this particular case, we developed a CFO package that was in line with what a competitive package would have been, which is $3.75 million, and that was the ongoing part of the package. But then we had two additional components that helped bridge. One was a sign-on deal, which helped buy the person out of some things that they needed to be bought out of, and was time-based. And the other piece was a performance-based vesting equity program. And there were some very tough hurdles in that one, but that got the person $5 million if they could do it, and brought the whole package just with the sign-on up to what he was making before. And it turns out, I think they, if I remember right, they didn't go with the $5 million. They just went with the 2.5, and the person took the job, and we made it equalized. But it just shows you, what we wanted to make sure in both of these cases, we had ongoing comp that could stand up to the scrutiny of governance, because both of these executives were going to be in the proxy, and were going to be highly visible from a governance perspective. So therein lies, we're about out of time, therein lies, I think, what we're seeing and what the trick is of kind of bridging these items. And, we see executive comp trends that you've all heard about continue. There are a lot of constraints now on exec comp and what you can do around governance, and there's a lot of ways for shareholders to exert pressure on boards, and they're doing it. And what maybe used to make sense doesn't make sense now. We often will see legal folks who are advocates for the executive, that's their job, kind of still come in with old concepts that might have made sense in the past, but really it puts the company in a difficult situation for the current and the future. And so our thought is, if we can all kind of understand these issues, explain them to the candidates, and empathize with the companies that are operating under these new rules, I think we'll all build better relationships, both with the candidate and with the clients, and be able to bridge the gaps and make a good situation out of a high-pressured one. So with that, we've got 1 minute before we go to the next speaker. Karen has us on a tight time frame here, so that's good. But any questions or comments that you all would have?
This is very helpful. When a company wants to pay the 75th percentile to close an executive, how do you counsel them to, quote, make it work?
Yeah. So this was this last situation was the case where they wanted 75th percentile pay, and we basically put it down to the 50th percentile, and then did the sign-on deal, which allowed it to come in. There are some cases where you might mix it up differently, 50th percentile on the salary and the bonus, 75th on the long term, call it out as an exceptional situation. But most of the time, if we can separate it out, call it a sign-on or a promo grant or something that separates out the piece that gets them to the 75th, that's the most long-run effective way to go. And our thought is, every executive doesn't have to be right at the 50th, but as a group, they kind of need to be in terms of being with good governance. And so if somebody's really special, playing a critical role, you can make an exception, but if you do it every time, then it becomes the rule. Okay.
One more?
Yeah, one more, and then we can...
Yes.
Yeah.
A quick question. Outside of base bonus equity as part of the compensation plan, I'm curious what you see as kind of some newer progressive thinking or additions to those components of compensation. I've heard about qualified savings plans that are kind of age-based, where you can put a lot more money aside based on your age that grows tax-free. I've seen some companies talk about maybe some insurance policies that would almost look pension-like. So I'm curious what you're seeing and that are kind of new and unique.
Yeah, so we do see some new things. They tend to be a little less fancy than they were in the past, only because, again, shareholders really like transparency, and some of these things can become pretty opaque. But a split dollar insurance policy allows the executive to pay for part of that policy. The company pays for part of it, and the person gets the cash benefit of that policy and the buildup of the value of that policy tax-free, and it allows some kind of a pension arrangement. So that would be an example. We do see earnings plans that's just like a supplemental retirement plan, but it comes in the form of a 401k-like plan as opposed to a pension plan. We did a very interesting one for an executive who was a founder, had really egregious provisions in his former employment agreement. The board wanted to get out of that former agreement, and the way we bought him out of it is we basically said, here's an annuity stream of dollars that you will get once you retire for whatever reason, or leave the company for whatever reason. It's a period certain amount of money. It goes to you or your heirs, whether you're dead or alive, and in return for that stream of money, you're not going to have all these other provisions, acceleration of equity, 280G, which is those change of control gross-ups and things of that nature. So it was a payment certain stream that we had committed to in that case. So there's a lot of things one can do, and of course the corporate airplane is always one of the most favorite, because while you get imputed income on the increment, on the marginal cost of the airplane, it's the value of it is a lot higher. So one has to be careful with how much they're doing that, but as long as one is and has an allocation, that can be a very popular one. Okay, so shall we go to the next one? I don't know. Because it's 2:30, right? Yep. Oh, I just don't want to. Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you. All right. I just don't want to steal time.